Snyder. I am a professor of political science here at Brown. I'm also it's not clear if I'm the acting director of GPD, the Graduate Program in Development, or the interim director of GPD. I think it's acting director, which I prefer, because it is a performance after all. So I'm the acting director of the Graduate Program of Development, and I know many of you, but not all of you. I want to say a few things before I introduce, since this is the first meeting of the DGS seminar, which is tied to the Graduate Program of Development. I want to pass around, we have a exciting schedule of events coming up through this colloquium over the semester. Please take a copy if you'd like and pass that around. Thanks, Ashu. And before I welcome our guest, the second speaker arrived for today, let me just say a couple of things about the Graduate Program of Development. It's based here at Watson, and which was founded, over a decade ago by Patrick Keller over here, Barbara Stallings, who's not here, myself, I was involved as well, and has been supported by a host of faculty from all over. Rick Locken, who was director of the Watson Institute, who's now provost, was very supportive of it. Ed Steinfeld, current director, Dr. Varshney has played a role, and David Skarbeck hopefully will play a role, our new colleague is here. Welcome again. And I think it's one of the most exciting things going in social science graduate training in the world today, certainly in the U.S. GPD is keeping interdisciplinarity alive in our increasingly disciplined world. Some like to call it a siloed world. I don't like that metaphor, especially in this day and age. So I'm a political scientist, and I can certainly say from the, hey Ben, come on in, have a seat. Thanks for coming. So from the vantage point of my discipline, political science, we are a discipline that's in a sort of between a hard and a harder place at the moment. My discipline is in treatment. Well, I'm not sure if we're in treatment or treatment is in. Probably both of those things are true. Experimental methodology and a focus on rigorous methodology is the key. I'm not going to, from a naive outsider view of other social science disciplines, forgive me if I insult everyone in the room in different ways, but sociology, I gather, has and continues to be somewhat parochial in its compass, with most sociologists focusing not on international issues, but in the U.S., on the United States. Economics is dominated by methodological monotheism. There's one method, and as David Skarbeck was telling me, in economics, you model and measure. That's what you do. I'm not going to say anything about anthropology because I'm agnostic at the moment. So we're keeping interdisciplinarity alive, and the premise is that we need the tools, we need all the help we can get. We need the tools, theories, concepts of multiple disciplines in order to grapple with the most pressing human problems of our day. For example, inequality, persistent inequality, problems like human and other kinds of security, climate change and environmental sustainability, and development, of course. And, these are big, complex, multifaceted problems. And to grapple with them effectively, the premise of GPD is that we need to draw on the diversity and wealth of tools, concepts, and methods from all the social science disciplines. Okay, so that's what this is about. And as I said, the DGS seminar is linked to it. So I want to invite all of you to join us as part of this interdisciplinary GPD community. And come to the seminars. I should add, as I mentioned, we always have a wine and cheese reception after the talks. So if nothing else, you'll be fed and you'll have good company. And as James Scott likes to remind people, he said, graduate students are a pretty lonely group, pretty lonely lot. So hey, here's some community, and it's a good one. So I invite you to join us and take a look at the schedule, and hopefully we'll be seeing a lot of each other. Okay, so let me turn to the distinguished colleagues who are visiting us today. It's a pleasure to have Rick Doner and Benoit Schneider here. Rick is the Goodrich C. White Professor of Political Science at Emory University, and he focuses on Southeast Asia regionally and the comparative political economy of development. He's the author of numerous books, including most recently The Politics of Uneven Development, Thailand's Economic Growth in Comparative Perspective, and also the co-authored book From Silicon Valley to Singapore, Location and Competitive Advantages in This Drive Industry. Driving seems to be a theme for you, Rick. His first book, I remember, came out long ago. Bernie Haas told me I had to go read it. Driving a Bargain, Automobile Industrialization of Japanese Firms to Southeast Asia in 1991. So this is Rick, and then we also have a friend and co-author who's been here several times before, Ben Schneider. Ben is the Ford International Professor of Political Science at MIT, where he also is the director of the MIT Brazil program. His area of expertise regionally is Latin America and substantively business politics, comparative capitalism, and also social policy. Among his most recent publications are the book New Order and Progress, Democracy and Development in Brazil, an edited book, and also the book Hierarchical Capitalism in Latin America, Business, Labor, and the Challenges of Equitable Development, and a book from about almost 15 years ago with Sylvia Maxfield, an edited book, Business and the State in Developing Countries, which I routinely assign in undergraduate classes. So they're here today to talk to us about the middle income trap. Those of you who are into decoding things will notice that the acronym for the middle income trap happens to be MIT. But I'm sure it's just a coincidence. Ben will enlighten us about that. So with no further introduction from me, please join me in welcoming Rick Owner and Ben Schneider back around.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I've been here for 12-some years. I was here a long time ago, and I continue to believe that this is really one of the jewels. If there's any place, and I'm not fishing for an offer here because I'm retired in 2 years, but if there's any place that I'd like to be, beside where I am, actually more than where I am right now, it's at Brown. You guys have a unique combination of scholars and approaches. I'm sure you appreciate it, but it's really a privilege to be with you guys. So this talk has really two objectives. One is to review some of the key points, and this is the kind of the major part of the talk, of an article that Ben and I recently published in World Politics called The Middle Income Trap, More Politics and Economics, and the focus, the motivation of that article was to address what we saw as a gaping hole in literature on what has become a fairly significant literature about a phenomenon that is the middle income trap, which we'll describe in a second. But also there are some extensions and implications of this article that we wanted to play out a little bit to get feedback from you guys. We're having to do with skill relation in particular, and so we're going to spend a little bit of time at the end on that. So the middle income trap, for those of you who are fortunate enough to have not read all this stuff, it's actually the focus of a burgeoning literature, certainly by the international financial institutions, and in many countries in the developing world, people are talking about this. And the argument really is that there are a group of countries that have moved into middle income and have stayed there longer than they're supposed to. These countries here. They started out here, they're here, and they have not moved for longer. They have taken a much longer time to get out into there than they should have based on historical experience. Furthermore, these countries, in some cases, have been fast growing, but their growth trajectories have been marked by a lot of slowdowns as well. So the point is, overall slow and volatile as well, erratic. And this is just a World Bank piece that to show that there are relatively few countries that have moved out from middle income. Especially highlighted here, of course, are the Korea, Taiwan, and one could begin to put China in here as well. Now, generally, economists argue that there's one core source of this, and that is productivity slowdowns. And here, this is some data figure on total factor productivity, and obviously, East Asia looks pretty darn good compared to Latin America and Brazil in particular. Just so you don't get the wrong idea, East Asia, maybe as a region, has done fairly well, but it's not just a Latin American problem. And here, we look at the country that I focused on a fair amount, one of the little tigers in the World Bank's view. And here, the figure on the right is labor productivity, which has gone down, and total factor productivity, which has also tended to decline and stagnate. And so the argument here from the World Bank, which I think is accurate, is that a lot of the initial growth of these countries moving into middle income came from moving from one sector to another, from low productivity to a higher productivity sector. And this basically is mobilization, accumulation and mobilization of capital across sectors. That's where it's come from. And the argument that we agree with is that this kind of growth by diversification has some limits. In the article, the focus mainly is on 9 large upper middle income countries that are listed here that account for a significant majority of all population in middle income countries except excluding China. And these are the countries that we're looking at. These countries generally are characterized by pretty low scores on international exams, PISA exams, TIMSS exam. Portions of the percentages of secondary school enrollment tend to be relatively low, tertiary education. And certainly R&D personnel is especially low. Investment in research and development, reflecting the personnel in R&D, is also quite low. Thailand is 0.25 or something like that. And generally, these countries are below the regression line where they should be in terms of, as you move up, you have to, higher income requires more innovation. And these countries are not innovating, they're not investing in R&D, they're not investing in or implementing good education training practices. So the question that motivated this whole thing a couple of years ago was, well, and after I had gone to a number of conferences in Asia where everybody was promoting the middle income trap, and then I started thinking, well, why is it a trap? After all, everybody agrees that the problem is productivity. Everybody agrees that the policies that you need to address productivity stagnation include improvement in human capital, technical training, better research and development, and different kinds of infrastructure, not just bridges and tunnels, but IT, certain kinds of testing and research facilities, etc. And then, of course, property rights and the usual. So we know what the problem is, agree on the policies, and there's agreement also when you look at this literature that institutions make a difference. Okay, big surprise, right? And there, by institutions, talking about administrative capacity, good regulation, etc. But more than that, there is an acknowledgement that politics plays a role, that you need political will, that leaders need long time horizons. And one of the things we want to emphasize here is that the kinds of policies required to get out of this, to improve productivity, take time to play themselves out. So one hears a lot about things called intertemporal bargains, right? That you have to make a bargain, the results of which will only come out in the long run. This is not like just building a school and you see bricks and mortar. And more than that, there's an agreement that you need consensus, that partners have to be involved, that it can't just be top down, right? That you need collaboration, that you need, at the extreme, deliberation, if you will, okay? And so, you know what to do, why doesn't everybody do it? And so the economists generally leave essentially this issue unaddressed, just basically do it. And in fact, there has been no theory about what to do and what is different, if anything, about the countries that are in the middle income, that are in this middle income trap. So, our argument, the first part of our argument is that not all traps are the same. That there's something different about this group of countries, or at least the challenges that they face. That moving beyond middle income requires moving beyond simply being able to accumulate and mobilize capital, from moving from agriculture to manufacturing, from textiles to electronics, etc. That in order to improve productivity, you have to do things like really improve technical training, really improve R&D, and these are different than simply move simply. I don't want to denigrate, because many countries in the world will give their eye teeth to beat Thailand. I know that. So I'm not in any way minimizing the accomplishment of those countries, but it's different. So first part is that not all traps are the same. This one is different. It has different requirements. The policies required to address productivity are tough to carry out. They require stronger institutions, and making strong institutions is a political ask. The economists usually say, well, here's what institutions do. They resolve collective action problems. They help interdependent parties gain from trade. Okay, fine and good. Where do you get that? And here's our main argument, that in order to have strong institutions, you need political support, broad political support, and in middle-income countries, that support is weakened by fragmentation, by several dimensions of fragmentation between and among key societal actors. And for those of you old enough to remember, there's aspects of this argument that resonate with old dependency theory, part of which emphasize disarticulation, fragmentation of society. So first of all, just note, how do you think about the difficulty of productivity of tasks? And you can think about this, there's a growing literature to say that not all policies are equally difficult or easy to implement. They tend to be harder to implement if they take longer time to yield fruit. They're more difficult to implement if a lot of actors are required to carry them out. They are more difficult to implement if they require a lot of information and different types of information. It can be technical, but it can also be site-specific. What works in northern Nigeria may not work in southern Nigeria for various reasons. Okay? There are winners and losers. The more losers they are and the quicker they get hit, the harder they are to implement. And also, policies whose results are not visible are often harder to implement. Compare a policy building schools, which you see and the politicians can take credit for, versus a curricular reform that takes time to yield fruit, and it's not very visible. You don't have everybody standing up on the tower and saying, look at this wonderful curricular reform, as opposed to look at this great school. Okay? And we know that doing this requires really tough institutions. And by institutions, we're thinking quite broadly. Not just government agencies, but business associations, something that Ben and I worked on in another life. Public-private consultative groups, public-private sector institutions, intermediary organizations. And what do strong institutions do? Well, we know that they consult. They're good at consultation. We know that they are good at providing credible rewards and sanctions. Actually, I can just. And maybe most important, they have to be able to monitor. And for those of you who haven't done so, it's really worth looking at the literature on monitoring and evaluation. It has tremendous consequences and relevance for core development challenges. It's a really interesting literature. Okay, so that assumes some degree of state capacity, at least. And the problem, however, is that in many cases, moving into the middle income status leaves states relatively weak, in part because these countries tend to be characterized by a high level of informality, which means that people don't pay taxes, in part. multinational corporations tend to dominate and can avoid strengthening the state and paying taxes. And in general, our argument is that bureaucratic capacity is lower, in part because prior development tasks were easier. That doesn't mean they were easy, but they were easier. And so, to summarize again, how do you create strong institutions? What are leaders' incentives to look for the long term, to create the institutions that would carry out these policies? Our argument is a demand side argument. Everything that we've seen so far is supply side. Our argument is a demand side argument. Where are the coalition partners who are going to get together and push government officials and organize to implement these things? And typically, we look back at history and we've seen that in many cases, strong development is a result of coalitions, of pacts, of corporatism of various kinds. So it's extremely important. So,
So thanks for organizing this and thanks for this opportunity. It's just the over here, and I take back all those things I said about Amtrak. I want to go in now to this issue of the kinds of social coalitions that might make a difference in building these institutions. And the reason we look at social institutions is because the kinds of institutions we're looking at are long-term investments that exceed sort of the normal horizons, short-term time horizons of politicians. Now you might think, well, a party, so a strong programmatic party could do this as well, bring together and sustain a coalition, but we don't see much of that in the cases we're looking at, possibly in Turkey. So in the absence of that, I think, well, what we need are strong social coalitions of the sort that will continue to put pressure on politicians to invest in these institutions. So then we look at the kinds of coalitions. We say, first of all, what are the main dimensions of fragmentation? So first of all, there's overall inequality. And I'll go into a little more detail on each one of these. These are highly unequal. The business community is fragmented on several dimensions. Most importantly for us to start with between, especially among large firms, between multinational corporations and domestic firms, often divided also by sector, where the multinationals are in manufacturing and the domestic firms are natural resources or services. Then the workers are split, and here the primary cleavage is between workers in the formal sector and the workers in the informal sector, which is usually 40 to 60% of the workforce in these large middle-income countries. One of the things that's interesting is that as we got into this was we said, well, how does the current transition, or possible transition from middle to high income look compared to the countries that did it first? And by the current measurements, the OECD countries, the wealthy countries, sort of made the jump in the 1970s. So if you think about what's that comparison, what does that look like, those countries then compared with these countries, middle-income countries now? And this is where we see new and deeper cleavages. Because business and labor are sort of always fragmented by sector, by region, and so forth, but levels of inequality, informality, and foreign capital are much higher now than they were in these earlier industrializers. So first of all, here you can see that this is the FDI. So, by the 21st century, it's pretty high across the globe. But if you look back in the 20th century, you see that the countries that made the transition earlier have much lower levels of FDI compared to today's middle-income countries. And if you went back further to the 70s and 80s, that percentage of FDI would be even smaller. Here, this is a measure of informality. Here it's inverted, so these are the richer countries that have lower levels of informality. So you can see by transition sort of happening from middle income to high income, roughly double in middle income countries compared to high income countries. And also much higher, the levels in high income countries now, in fact, higher than they were from what historical data we have when they were mid-20th century. Inequality. This is well known. So these countries, large middle-income countries, are very unequal. But what's interesting compared over time. So this is sort of the bottom line here is it follows a sort of Piketty dip. So as the early developers grew in the 20th century, income inequality dropped until about 1980, and then it starts to come up. Nothing like that happened in middle-income countries. This is a somewhat different set of countries. Among the middle-income countries there, they start at high levels of inequality, and they stay at high levels throughout the 20th century and into the 21st. I want to spend a lot of time here. We're trying to think, well, what do political scientists really know about the effects of inequality on politics? And it turns out there's no single sort of consequence that you can point to, but everybody thinks that it has a lot of negative consequences. So generally it reduces opportunities for cooperation, entrenched elites. Norris Hassan Robinson, a poster child of entrenched elite. Anybody recognize this man?
Yes.
Who is it?
Carlos Slim.
Okay, and it's not just my opinion, it's also the World Bank's idea. So he had the telecom monopoly there. This is another consequence of high inequality. And also, inequality tends to be associated with higher levels of clientelism and populism, which would be another element that gives rise to the kind of volatility you see in economic performance. So that's our overall view of sort of the problems of constructing coalitions and the kinds of fragmentations and cleavages that impede that. And as Rick said, sort of our second goal and what we're working on now is to say, okay, we have this overview of what it looks like and the challenges of escaping the middle income trap. And so let's drill down and look more closely at particular policies that are associated with getting out of the trap. So education, everybody agrees, is the key. So we want to get even more specific and look at technical and vocational education because we think it's there. If there is a sort of interest on the part of business, this is where you see them pushing for it. So we want to sort of take a case where we think we could find a coalition. So we're still seeking that coalition, but this is what we're trying to figure out. And so, yeah, a lot of people see a lot of good things happening from education, including social inclusion, more common through in many countries through technical education than general education. I don't know why Rick put this in there about skill. We can come back to that if we want to, because there is, there are general skills and specific skills, and this takes us into more of the specific skills, so those distinctions kind of are difficult to sustain. So when we look across the middle income countries, and this is one measure, sort of the secondary percent of students in high school that are on the vocational track. So you see it's quite high and steady. Number of students across Europe are in technical education. Then it varies. The U.S. would be close to zero. Japan has lower levels because they have a famous system of sort of firm level training. And then you look at the middle income countries here, you can see there's really not much progress in the last 25 years. So we're sort of at lower levels overall, 10%. Upper middle income countries, yes, a bit more, up to 15, 17%. Latin America is lagging here, dropping even down to 10%. And then you can see some of the variation across these larger middle income countries. So this is the first indication that, that there's not a strong demand for this kind of technical education. But then we think, you're probably thinking, well, enrollments aren't going to tell you the whole story because we don't know what they're really learning. Is a good quality technical education. And we're still working on good data for that. But this will give you a sense of the countries that sort of take vocational education more seriously are spending more on it than general education. So countries above this line here are the ones that spend more per student on technical education. And the ones below are the ones that spend more on general education per student. So you can see that the famous case of Germany, Sweden are way up there in terms of what they're spending devoted to technical education. A few countries, this is OECD data, so we only have 3 middle income countries, so Turkey, Chile, and Mexico. But already you can see that Mexico is not devoting much in terms of per student spending. Now there's several authors who come together with a general theory about openness and trade driving investment in education generally. So this is one of the hypotheses we're looking at. Two ways to think about it. One is that how are we doing on time?
About 10, 12 minutes.
Yeah, that's the worst time I can go to. So there are two ways to think about this openness and training and education. One is that the more firms are subject to international competition, the more they're going to want to have more skilled workers to increase productivity. So that would be something to press business, to press government to provide this, which is the short version of sort of the Korea and Taiwan stories. Then there's another, Ben Ansel has another one that's also that if you're competing globally, then there is, the middle class doesn't worry about having more skilled workers coming to compete away the skill premium that comes with skill training. So everybody can become skilled. So this should remove a political block. Now, the slide I have to show you, oh wow, it's here. Okay. This I just sent from the train. So this this shows secondary enrollment, and this is trade openness. So at least with the enrollment data, we're not seeing any relationship. So either the enrollments are capturing it, or it isn't having its effect on pushing business to demand higher investment in vocational training. So this is our argument instead. Generally, I thought the business side, this is, take this from the World Bank, I said business just needs to be educated on how important education is, and then they will push for it. And we think, no, it's not a problem with not knowing their interests. We think they have different interests that generally don't include pushing for education. Multinationals, we know that they can poach workers from other firms, and when they enter, they can get them already skilled. If they really need skilled workers, they can move elsewhere. Often they do a lot of training in-house because they have that slack to do that. Domestic firms, either many of them are in sort of natural resource sectors that don't need a lot of skilled workers, and if they're in sectors that are capital intensive like mining, then they need skilled workers, but not very many of them. The domestic, the small and medium enterprises is where we think that you find most sort of need for, and you see this in the surveys, that they have a harder time filling positions for skilled workers. But of course, they face the problems of collective action and political pressure. So they are not usually big players in this. So again, the Turkish case is interesting. Among workers, then there's a split. I mean, if there's a lot of training going on within firms, then the workers who are in the formal sector are not necessarily interested in investing outside of that, or only human capital. Workers in the formal sector generally don't need skills, so also not interested. And one indicator for lack of interest generally is that in surveys in Latin America, 2/3 of respondents think that their education systems, their local schools are fine. So there isn't a feeling that we have to do something to fix this. And that goes up to like 2/3 among just 4 respondents. So this is the basic issue, thinking about education and the kinds of cleavages that we were discussing that we think is driving this lack of education, investment in education. And you wanted to carry on with something more about.
Yeah, a couple more. So the next step is to try to test these arguments. The implication is that there is a low demand on the part of business and part of labor. And so are we right? These are assertions. They have some prima facie credibility based on the broad data, but what we're interested in is going out and saying, doing work and talking to firms, for example, and saying, well, how much do you actually invest in training? To the extent that you invest in training, is it in-house or is it more collective? And we're especially interested in kind of broader collective club or public goods types of training. How do you do it? If you do it more collectively, do you do it through intermediate organizations, business associations, or their specialized agencies, research technology organizations? So one is to do firm interviews and firm surveys. The independent variable side, of course, is the assumption is that this will vary with ownership. It will vary by size. It should vary by technological level. Theoretically, firms that are under greater pressure from external market forces should, other things being equal, invest or care more about training. But if they can do it at home, if they can do it in-house, they won't do it, at least in the host countries or collectively. And then is it influenced by the nature of the labor force? So some of you may have heard this, this statistic that in many Chinese auto firms, 20% are formal, regular workers, 80% are informal. So does that proportion influence how much you train and where you train? And then are there intervening variables? What about the impact of political electoral rules, coalitional instability, the numbers of veto players, etc.? And then are there other institutions such as the financial system, such as corporate governance, all of the things that we are used to thinking about when in the literature on types or varieties of capitalism that can influence these things? And then where might we look at this? And so one of the things that I intend to do is to do a couple of comparative cases, sectoral cases, both cross-national and within countries. So I've been working on rubber, comparing Malaysia and Thailand, two of the biggest rubber, 90% of rubber, natural rubber comes out of Southeast Asia. Almost all of the rubber gloves that you may be examined with come from Malaysia, right? Not necessarily, so there are differences between these countries, same sector. Within a country like Malaysia, there are big differences in terms of the strength of the electronics industry in different regions, different sectors in Thailand, food versus automotive. What's the impact of these different variables? So one question that we have is this a useful way to do it? Because what we're doing is going within country, looking at particular sectors, particular places, to find what you might think would be what are known as kind of coordinated market economies that provide good trading across sectors, across firms in a sector. We're going to look for those in places where the country overall does not exhibit those kinds of capacities. And another issue is, who cares, right? Suppose you find that Chile is really good at farming salmon or whatever it might be, right? Okay, does that have any impact on other parts of the Chilean economy? If Malaysia is really good in rubber, does that have anything to do with what it does in automobiles? Okay. Lastly, there are a couple of some theoretical big picture things that come in here. Our argument is implicitly based on an idea of path dependence. There's something about the institutions and the interests that develop as you move into middle income that constrains you, that are hard to change to move out of middle income. Does reliance on natural resources at one period of time constrain you for a subsequent period of time? So path dependence is one issue. A second is to kind of fight against or counter what typically you see as the institutional hegemony in development studies. Get the institutions right. You now don't have to get prices right, you got to get institutions right. Well, where do institutions come from? Typically, the stop at just get the institutions right and not look at the background. How important are political institutions such as encompassing parties? Can they make a difference? And what happens if they're encompassing like populists? That's a whole issue. And last, kind of implicit here, I think, and Ben and I have never discussed this really, but is there in today's world some implicit contradiction or tension between countries being integrated with the rest of the world and integrated within themselves? Between a conflict between external and internal integration. That's it. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to try to continue a tradition, I don't know if it's going to continue or not, from this seminar way back, which was to hold the first round of questions for students, for graduate students. So if you're not a graduate student, please don't ask a question. So any students have questions they'd like to get on the table? Okay. professors talk.
And any questions of clarification?
Yeah.
What is this? What are you talking about?
Hannah Barron.
I have a question, and thank you so much for the presentation. I have a question on the suggestion that the formal and informal sectors are fragmented and separate, and what sort of cases and evidence you're looking at for that assertion, and are they really split when people who are perhaps informal or formal workers are working in the same sector? So what does it mean by, what do you mean by that they're fragmented?
Yeah, that's a great question because, in part because we don't fully know, what precise contours of the informal sector. And what it means too, now there's a growing emphasis, and the last figure I saw was if you take the 40 to 50 range for the informal sector, then there's another 10 to 15 for those people working fully outside of the legal economy, and there's another 10 to 15% who are working in formal firms, but not on the firm's books. So it gets certainly on the edges of the divide between formal and informal. It gets quite fuzzy. The other thing, and you're probably thinking too, is there's mobility across that line over time. People can move in and out of the informal sector and the formal. So the boundary is pretty porous, but I think there are a set of workers who have pretty long tenure in firms, do not move in and out of the informal sector, sort of what used to be called the labor aristocracy. So there are those four workers, and then on the other side, the foreign workers is primarily the informal sector that sort of works there and expects to stay there. So those would be the most rigid divide. More fluid group in between. And that group may also sort of form preferences and think about skills education, also serve as a family unit. So you may want one member in the formal sector so you have access to some of the benefits that go along with that, as well as the informal sector because you can have more flexibility. So we see it more on the edges where there'd be a structure divide in terms of their expectations and career goals. Is that how you see it?
Yeah. Good. And I mean, so there's definitional issues, and Ben's right on this question of the blurring. I mean, more and more you hear the term contingent work, not just informal. And the contingent work includes people who are working for third-party contractors, right? Who may be formally employed in a factory, in a Toyota factory, but are actually employees of a third-party contractor and are on short-term. So if you think about time horizons as being important to both interests, right? If you're going to have to invest and to want to push people to invest in skills training, you have to have the sense that you're going to be there for a while. So you don't have these long time horizons, even in the more what people call the formalized informal sector, right? And second is there's issues of collective action capacity. If you're moving in and out, even if you have these preferences, how do you actually mobilize for these kinds of things? So it's the definitional issue, it's blurring of interest, it's instability of interest, and incapacity or weakening of collective action capacity.
I mean, that is another growing sector is the part-time and temporary short-term contracts. So you could be formal, but you're hired year by year kind of thing. The figure that always strikes me for Latin America is that the median job tenure is 3 years. So that's what you can expect if you're an average worker to change jobs every 3 years. And often that means moving from one sector to another. If you get that median, that means there's some people who change jobs, a good portion are changing jobs every year or so. So that probably bears more direct on the skill issue, because then your incentives for getting skilled in a particular area are low.
And then there's the issue, the huge kind of elephant in many rooms, and that is migrant workers. And one of the things that, looking through the literature you see is that the East Asia NICs, they now have a lot of migrant workers. But that migration did not occur until there was a fairly high level of stealing of the indigenous populations, whereas, at least in the Southeast Asian countries, it's happened simultaneously or prior to the stealing of the local population. But it's great, it's a really important research topic for you guys.
So let's take a couple, I see a couple of student hands. So your hands up, say who you are, please. You have to be a student. And then we'll go to you, and then if we have one more student, great. If not, whatever. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I was particularly interested in the implications of what this research has for collective action and coalition building. And I particularly thought it was very interesting that you said that there's a question of whether or not you need strong institutions and perhaps like political parties that are sort of all-encompassing and sort of try to build consensus and then take this idea of like moving the action forward. And the question that I have actually is.
Could you say who you are, please? So,
Sure. My name is Jaswant, and I'm a first-year PhD student in the Department of Sociology. So my question actually relates to perhaps it's like a step beyond the scope of this discussion itself. As I was wondering if you could speak to what are ways in which those coalition of groupings could be formed. And do we actually have examples, at least contemporary, or maybe in the past decade or two, that where this sort of consensus building and this sort of like bringing these groups together has actually happened?
let's take, and then take this question. Who are, could you say who you are? And
Vladimir, I am a undergrad, third year political science. So I just was wondering how you reconcile your emphasis on vocational education with the sort of American exception that you kind of touched on really briefly, because as you mentioned, America spends nearly zero on vocational education under its education budget, yet most of it, sustained growth that we have in this country, comes from a lot of innovation, specifically in our sort of different sectors, especially the technology sector.
yes. So any other student questions? Yeah, say who you are, please.
Hi, I'm Salma. I am last year PhD student in sociology. You said that not all tracks are the same, so I'm interested in whether a path from natural resources is stickier than a path from high FDI. What are the implications of those different ways that we're at middle income cities?
Any other? Say who you are, please.
Well, thank you. First, I'm Emma Morasa, PhD candidate in social science. I have two different questions really quickly. The first one is I'm wondering the extent to which the case you chose affect the answers you're getting. So you focus on education, but you mentioned in the list of policy prescriptions, there's also an emphasis on investment in research and development, for example. So do you think that the same logic would apply, and how does the explanation that you propose travel? And then the other thing is maybe more of a curiosity, but there is one slide on literature on the relationship between inequality and politics, and you mentioned unequal participation, the lead factor of institutions, and rent seeking, clientelism. And then this kind of disappears, and we got to the conversation about education and the fragmented coalition, fragmented interest, and the lack of a push for investment in education. And I just wonder what happened to this literature, to this discussion, and how does it relate? It just kind of vanished, and I'm curious. Thank you.
That's great. And are you a student?
I am.
Okay, one more, and then we'll let them respond. Go ahead. Who are you?
I'm a fourth year in the economics program. Thinking about the demand for, there's a slide that mentions kind of the middle class demand for education. Do you have an idea, like a model maybe, or some road for like the phenomenon of brain drain? Like people do invest in education, but since people are mobile, those skills kind of move away to the global market.
This is why this place is so good. Your questions are great. These are great. Not every university with development people would have be able to ask these kinds of questions, especially not MIT. You want to start with that?
necessity, you would think to bring together groups, to create coalitions, and to have a program for the longer term. But it wouldn't fit in the article because there was too much to go on. And it would also seem to be one of those things where the party's structure doesn't map onto social cleavages. So if we're going to go down, there's a lot of sort of electoral institutions, party systems that's going to affect also how the parties come to get coalesce or not. I do a lot of work in Brazil, and they've now pushed the record number of effective parties to 35. So they're an extreme case where you have this sort of vociferous kind of tendency in the political system. But two of the cases where we do see sustained investment in education, particularly technical education, are Chile and Turkey. Chile is now officially high income, but it's on the cusp. So it's sort of still dealing with a lot of the same issues. And that's one of the cases we have a coalition of parties that have been in power for more than 25 years, so we've really been pushing to do that. The Turkish case is interesting because, it's programmatic in sort of Islamist sense, but underneath that, there's some very interesting work showing that there was a sort of coalition that formed among small Muslim business, small and medium-sized enterprises, and the government over issues of technical training. So it started with the religious bent, but then Erdogan wanted to sort of cultivate this small business movement, so they happened upon technical education, which is really seen some significant investment in the past couple of decades. Vocational education in the U.S. This is this may require a longer conversation. But the idea, this drawing on the rise of capitalism discussion, is that the idea in the U.S. is that you have weaker specific skills in the kind of areas of manufacturing, and we've seen a lot of deindustrialization in the U.S. And where you see growth and all the great innovation is in areas of general skills. So think software, programming, coding, those kinds of areas. And so that doesn't come out of the more technical training. The other side of that, of course, is that technical training can be particularly important for those at the bottom of the socioeconomic hierarchy, because it eases an entry into the labor force. Whereas in the U.S., that's sort of public policy doesn't treat that very, very much, and doesn't worry about the transition from high school to state labor, as they do in the case of industrial and vocational education. On the aspects of the different kinds of traps and whether natural resources or FDI matters more, I have strong priors on that, but I think there is something that having a domestic business class to work with on these issues is going to be crucial. So if you're really, if FDI is really very strong and there is very little in terms of domestic business class, I think that complicates a lot, this coalition building and institution building. And I'm thinking now, one of the cases we look at, one of the recent cases of entry into the developed world is Finland. And Finland, and actually the rest of Scandinavia, sort of started in natural resources and made that transition. And Finland did it much more explicitly with public policies, sort of pushing Nokia from forestry to cell phones. Afterwards, it didn't work out so well, but the first worked quite well.
But jumping on that, there's on the U.S. case, Ben, simply add a couple things. One is that the U.S. is generally drawing on this regard to capitalism literature, generally been quite good at radical innovations and kind of really new things that come out of universities, etc. We have been, in general, certainly not exclusively, not as good about the kinds of incremental adaptation innovations that we're talking about for productivity increases for developing countries. Because if you think about what innovation means in most parts of the developing world, it's not doing something totally new. It's taking something new to you, new to your firm, and adapting it, adopting it, absorbing it, commercializing it, etc. And in fact, I'm actually partly here to participate in a workshop, a book workshop, of one of your fellows, Jonas Nunn, whose work comparing the US, China, and Germany on renewable energy industries addresses this in a really interesting way, showing how the US is very good at kind of cutting-edge startups, but not very good at all in terms of producing components and commercializing, moving these things into mass production. So what really we're talking about is the kind of skills that are required for this kind of incremental movement in process and process into product. Now, there is, as Andrew knows better than most of us, there are pockets of exceptions where this is not the case. But one of the places that I and a couple of students have started looking at is a place that I'm sure all of you are well aware of, and that's Greenville, South Carolina. Anybody ever been to Greenville? Anyway, it turns out Greenville is very successful. It's successful in terms of attracting a large number of foreign investors, but they have something called Greenville Technology Institute, Greenville Technical College, that trains thousands of people, is well integrated with Clemson, with the primary, secondary schools, and they really train people on all levels. And so one of the things that's interesting is what is the particular combination of factors that ended up this place in South Carolina, of all places, to have this really what I think is a cutting edge model for developing these skills. And it really, again, it's not super high end, although Clemson does some super high end. It's more in terms of the process. One point about the FDI, I agree with Ben, and here, this gets to another question in terms of the examples of success. I started getting interested in the rubber industry in Southeast Asia, in part because I always worked on autos and textiles, and I was sick of being in cities, and I thought, do something that will get me into the countryside. So rubber is produced in the south, you get to the plantations, and the factories are near there and everything like that. And it turns out that there are radical differences between the strength of local firms and innovation in Malaysia versus Thailand. Thailand produces a lot of good stuff, but it's all multinationals, or almost all multinationals. Whereas in Malaysia, it really depends significantly on the innovation of local firms, especially ethnic Chinese Malaysian firms. Why? How do you explain this? Because there are ethnic Chinese all over the place, plenty in Thailand, and the key factor seems to be the coalitional importance of rubber for the ruling coalition in Malaysia as opposed to Thailand. So I've just started playing with this, but that's an example of where natural resources was able to be developed through moving downstream, taking rubber, processing the rubber, and doing innovations in the processing, and then doing innovations in terms of things like rubber gloves. So just to give you a quick example, the whole rubber glove industry was almost wiped out by latex allergies. So anytime you all go to the doctor now, you know they'll ask you, or the dentist, are you allergic to latex? Well, there was a big scare, especially when AIDS came on, and latex was a big deal, and almost wiped these guys out. They had to figure out how to produce low latex gloves, and it was not easy. And it's a perfect example of learning of indigenous technology, working together, public-private sector deliberation and consultation.
A couple of things we didn't get to. The issue of if I look at education versus R&D, or actually, if you look at sort of the economist prescriptions for the institutions that need to build to escape the trap, it almost always starts with human capital and innovation and R&D. But then the list can include sort of financial intermediation, judicial system, sort of a range of other institutions that you would need to build. And what got us into education was, one, there was agreement that this is absolutely crucial. That in fact, almost no countries that get to high income except a few oil exporters without education. R&D, we really need that. And you have to think of R&D as not, the next disruptive innovation, but rather you have to invest in R&D just to keep up with the technology that's being developed elsewhere. So you need 1%, 1.5%, but you don't necessarily need to get up to 2%. Spain and Italy sort of get along with lower levels of R&D, so that's not as sort of absolute necessity as education is. And then others, there's a problem with, does the financial sector come before growth, or does it accompany it, and you get that after you become high income? So with education now, the consensus among economists, really that comes first. That precedes growth and pushes growth. So that's why we want to focus in on that as opposed to the other range of institutions you need to build along the way also to get to high income.
Please get to some of those before getting to and that is, there's also kind of a question of what is development and the potential that education has to promote a more inclusive development. I think kind of facing than R&D. But the other part is, when you think about R&D, more and more you look into this, and what emerges is in the best of all worlds, there's an overlap between R&D and education. And that R&D in some cases, and again, I'm going to put a plug in for an institution that I realize has become really quite interesting, and that is public testing and research service. You see these things, testing and research together. So if you have a product and you're a local firm and you don't know if it works, where do you get it tested? You give it to Toyota and they send it to Nagoya and it comes back failed, no, or do you go, which is what the Japanese did and what many countries do, is you have a local area, you have a local facility, you take it, local people, and they say, it doesn't work, let's figure out why it doesn't work. And let's train your people on the methods through which it will work. So these kinds of institutions don't sound real sexy, but they're really at the crux of kind of the overlap between R&D for many developing countries and training and learning.
The last was just the question about what happened to equality in politics. Oh yeah, but I mean, two things. One is that was a break in the presentation that I didn't figure out quite yet. But the more serious answer is that inequality, it is something to think about. What is these countries are trying to make that transition with much higher levels of inequality than earlier industrializers. So what generally does that mean for the kinds of politics that will more likely emerge in these countries? So that's where we get into discussions of clientelism and populism. But then to get back to specific issues about which have their own damaging consequences for growth and development. But to get back to the issue of how might you build coalitions with particular kinds of institutions like education and R&D, then inequality doesn't have a direct bearing on that. Then we go back to the sort of more immediate cleavages within business and within labor. So we sort of come down a level to look directly at sort of preferences and interests at that level. Okay.
So let's open up the floor to anybody for questions. We'll take a round, and I'll remind everyone that there's wine and cheese reception at 6:30 downstairs, so stick around, you're rewarded. Rick Locke, and we'll go, Tony will take a round, and then Richard.
So, and Rick, thanks, that was a really terrific presentation. If I understand the argument, so the argument is that the reason why there's not sufficient training at these firms is because of a variety of manufacturing problems or distorted incentives, and that can be fixed with strong institutions that can provide this kind of public training. And that to get those strong institutions, we have to have certain kind of political coalitions to drive it. I think that's actually a really great argument. And so what I was trying to think as you were speaking is, how would you test it? What would be maybe a series of almost natural experiments that you could do? And so, Rick, I think on electronics, that's a perfect one. because what we know about electronics is that you'll have the same firms or even the same contractors, electronics, all these others, who are multinationals in themselves operating across countries. And that in all of these sectors, and you said the same thing about mining, but in all these sectors, you do have direct employees and contract workers working side to side. But that what they can do with the contract work is legislated differently across countries. So a number of years ago, I studied electronics, and I studied it in Malaysia, the Czech Republic, Mexico, et cetera, looking at the same firms. And there was real variation, so you could actually see across these countries using the same sector, trying to just mine that variation in terms of the incentives to invest or not invest, depending on your workforce. Was it different? And I think that that would be a nice window into testing that hypothesis. And likewise, Ben, I was just thinking about, Brazil. So you can have variation across the same sector controlling for countries, and I could imagine you could have variation within the same country controlling for regions. So I remember again years ago looking at the Senai and other system institutions in Brazil, and my memory was that the governance body of the state level institutions were represented as the local business community. And they operated, even when they were trying to provide training for the same sector, for firms in the same sector, they operated very differently, for example, northeast or the southeast or across the northeast, et cetera. So it would be very interesting to say, here's this institution, it's sort of a, let's say, quasi-public institution. It is supposed to provide the same service for these same firms. Why did they do things so differently in terms of what training they provide, to whom do they provide, under what terms, et cetera, and is it related to the different economic interests of the state that might be also connected to different political party interests? And so there might be, these are just two ideas of how do you play with some sort of variation that exists in the real world that might allow you to get it at that thing. And I'm sure that the two of you have seen this paper that Judith Tendler had done in '99 or 2000 around the Devil's Deal. And it was all about training.
That's right.
About why firms did not want to train.
Yeah, something like that. Which as I was listening to you, I'm like, yeah, this sounds remarkably familiar. But I think it's a great project. And I think the variation across countries, within countries, and across sectors will allow you to get to test your own hypothesis.
Great. Tony, you want to say yours or what else?
Tony Levitas, I'm a fellow here. I was also struck by the difference, the gap between the first half of the macro failures in political coalition and the jump to the technical education and R&D. And I guess where I want to push it is all the countries, if you look at the Nordics and then if you look at the famous Chinese, India, today, there's a strong case for the development being focused on very serious primary school education. So the Indians made the choice to invest heavily in technical education. The Chinese invested very heavily in universal basic education, putting emphasis on the first hand. So it strikes me that the coalition that fails, and somehow is the coalition for a commitment to mass education at the front, and the lots of the political failures that you're talking about are the failures, the sort of well-known failures of the tax state in the developing world, the inability to get elites to buy into long-term taxation for massive public goods. So and the same thing I think you would see if you looked at the Nordics, which is that they started off with intensive investment in the primary education. So I'm really wondering whether the attempt to find the workable coalitions at the micro level could ever possibly get you back to the macro level that you started out at.
At the macro level, you're referring
To the overall political failures of these institutions, right? I mean, in some sense, is it, I mean, I think the normative intent would be to say, okay, can we find coalitions where particular business interests are willing to make the investment in training, and could those then be worked up into some macro deal? I understand the normative intent of the work. And it seems to me that that's unlikely if the political coalition failure is at a much higher level, and that empirically there's evidence that suggests that the real developmental push has to come with good primary and secondary education, which may or may not include technical education, but can't be done independently.
Okay, Richard?
Yeah.
You said you are.
Richard Boucher, I'm a fellow here too. I wonder how much of this story is regulatory capture and other forms of corruption, sort of implied by some of the things you said about politics and institutions. And that firms, sectors, and industries that aren't subject to competition, that are protected by regulations and tax code. The productivity tends to stagnate, maybe even at higher levels of income as well.
Yeah, I can jump in, but you want to go ahead? Who are you?
I'm Adani. I'm a new fellow here. So I have a kind of naive question and a naive comment as well. So the naive question is, how do we know that one of the reasons that we don't see, or that you have not seen incentives on the part of businesses in these countries to invest in R&D? I mean, you said that in part it's a capacity issue, but in part it also seemed to be an incentive issue, that there are key actors who in other contexts would have wanted R&D, but in these contexts don't seem to want that kind of spending. How do we know that it's not the product of the more sort of mundane and maybe intractable fact that it doesn't make sense for these businesses to use these sorts of technologies in a context where the price of labor is very, very cheap? I mean, I know this is sort of the classic Bob Allen explanation for why these countries stagnate at this point, which is that one of the reasons that catch-up is supposed to be actually not that difficult institutionally is because you can just import technology from overseas. And as I understood Bob Allen's argument, the difficulty is that it just doesn't make sense in the context where you can rely on cheap labor to implement these kind of technologies. So how do we know that the problem isn't that more mundane issue rather than these more difficult issues about constructing strong institutions? And then the comment relates to the research strategy that you outlined at the end, which is that it seemed to me that the argument as you set it up, and actually I think one of you even alluded to this, the argument as you set it up invites a comparison between countries that have failed the middle income trap and countries that have succeeded at escaping the middle income trap.
Or sectors within those countries that show upper middle, that show potential.
Tendencies.
Show movement.
Yeah. But it seems to me that that is an interesting comparison, but that's variation on failure rather than comparing failure to success. And I just wonder why you haven't considered comparing countries that succeeded at breaking through the middle income trap, either the OECD countries in the 60s and 70s or some other countries, rather than comparing, why the less ambitious comparison rather than the more ambitious comparison?
Yeah, presumably any upper income country.
Yeah. Yeah, sure.
By definition. So I have a quick comment question as well. Comment builds on Richard Boucher's question about capture. And Master Olson is remembered for his book, The Rise and Fall of Nations. But that was sort of the dark side of coalition, sort of causing sclerosis and jamming up institutions and keeping places in low-level or middle-level equilibrium traps. So how do you handle that way of thinking about coalitions? And then the question, well, I guess I have a question. The real question, though, is, this is not a dissertation project. you two had dissertation projects a long time ago. And, you know, these are two, dare I say, senior scholars collaborating, first of all. There are 8 or 9, 10 countries. It's very macro, middle range, and theoretical aspirations. So what can you offer for graduate students who have dissertations or will have dissertations? They can't do this. I mean, I heard a little bit of field work coming in with your rubber in Malaysia versus Thailand stuff. And don't worry, you don't have to do this for your dissertation.
Well, to take the last question first, it seems to me that what typically one should do, I guess 2 things. One is, what are the observable implications of this whole argument? And then look at the observable, there are any testable implications, and there are. And that's one of the things that we think about doing is, I plan to go and spend a month in Thailand talking to firms and trying to figure out, do they act the way we predict that they're acting, right? So one could simply do an analysis along the lines that Rick Lott was talking about and saying, same firms, different countries, same firms, different places, different provinces, and look at, is there variation? Is it really a firm? Is it purely firm, or is it firm interest mediated by sociological or political considerations? One could do that. You could look at the observable implications and say, are we right about these distinctions? Do you have a situation where firms and sectors where there's a higher percentage of informals have consistently less commitment, whether it's in-firm or collective, to technical vocational education training? There's another issue here that I think somebody raised it or somebody, and that is, political institutions, we kind of brought them in at the end. There's these comments, do parties make a difference? And frankly, I have a lot of trouble because I'm not sure if parties are results of these things or intervening variables contribute to these things, or both. There's a feedback loop. So one question has to do with, under what conditions do you get encompassing parties as opposed to clientelist or populist parties? Do the origins of those kinds of institutions have to do with the kinds of inequality and fragmentation that we're talking about? Those are all testable propositions.
Yeah, no, and I would add, I think that would be our main message, is sort of think, we in economists and anybody working in development can think of a lot of the institutions we'd like to see. But then you can, take the institution you think is crucial and try to see what is the social coalition that might support that or push that to come into existence. So you can break it down, I think, into much more manageable pieces. Let me make a couple of reactions. Rick, I like that, trying to look at sort of natural variation that you could see across countries or across states. And Brazil is a very interesting example because it has a corporate system for business associations that survived almost going on 100 years, that forces business into a kind of collective action and gives them then dedicated resources from a payroll tax to manage for training. So this is really sort of an artificial example of how to create that. But you're right, in some cases the training, even though they have it all organized, the corporatism gives them weird sort of internal organization and representation, so the training is not necessarily geared to the sort of leading edge kinds of firms and activities that we might expect to see it. So there's a lot of sort of on-the-ground training for firms with particular needs without a vision of where to go. And the overall confederation for Brazil, I actually point this out, was they came out in the beginning of the year in January and said, here are our 9 priorities for reforms in Brazil. And this is before all the other scandals came out. So this is just looking at how we want to reform Brazil. And it had legal reform, taxes, everything you can imagine. The 9th was education. It was like the bottom list. It was just like, let's have some more education. So really, at least at the national level, we're not thinking about this as an issue. Tony, you're absolutely right about the primary education being So that, this is a precondition. And if you look at the PISA scores, what's important to do to translate it is 40 points is equal to a year. So the average for Latin America and our countries is about 80 points behind OECD, the rich countries. That's really 2 years behind by the time you get to the age of 15. So that's, a lot of that's cumulative from primary education, where you start falling behind and you can't make it up later on. The regulatory capture is, I think this is clearly an issue in many of these middle-income countries. And I can think there was a couple of pieces that have been done by Randall Morgan Associates looking at sort of the percentage of inherited wealth among the billionaires in each country and how that correlates with growth. But other than that, I haven't seen, it doesn't come up in the, when the econometricians run the numbers on middle income tracks, it's not something that they try and include to say this could be one of the key variables there. That said, I do think it's crucial that some of these firms are not in very competitive markets or have some kind of capture. And they're part of the ones that are saying, we don't need training. So they're part of this missing coalition. They say we make our money in other ways, so we don't need that. The last thing I'll say about the comparisons, even though it's gone, is that we did look. I mean, for that first graph, there were 13 countries that from 1960 to 2008 escaped. And so we said, well, what about these escapees can we say in general? What lessons? And we broke them out, and it's a strange bunch of countries. So among the 13, if I remember correctly, but a couple of the, Taiwan and Korea are those developmental states that you could say are really products of the Cold War, the late 20th century. They have great entrance to the European Union, which both affects them economically, but also sort of makes politics more centripetal. And then you have these tiny countries, Equatorial Guinea, I'm not sure how many people live there. Puerto Rico, I don't know why the World Bank includes that as a country, but anyway.
This is the problem.
These are cases that are difficult to say, okay, here's the key lessons. And in part, it's also that even in the late 20th century, it was easier to make that transition than it is sort of now in the 21st century. So really the world, the technological frontier, the organization of production, all those things have shifted in ways that say you can't go back and replicate one of these experiences.
Maybe I'll just make it, in terms of dissertations, again, going back to that, one of the articles that has always inspired me, that I think is extremely relevant to this our whole enterprise, is Andrew's, one day I want to go look at Infotech, if it's still there, right? Hopefully it is, right? But if you all haven't read that, you need to read this article because it is a focus on a particular institution in a little country dealing with a big question, and it really shows the kind of overlap between somebody's R&D to some degree and training and improvement, and some of the political and sociological variables that come in. And that's an example of the kind of research that I think could be done. We, in this book that we did on the disk drive industry, we in fact interviewed firms the same firms that operated in Thailand and Singapore who had very, very different behavior. In one situation, they participated in collective action. In the other situation, they said, we're keeping our head down. There's too much crap in this place. We'll just do our thing. One other thing about mass education. I think it's an interesting question that you've worked on, but what are the different coalitional requirements and the incentives to develop mass education as opposed to technical vocational education? My sense is that mass education has an additional and very almost prior function, and that is citizenship. And that's really important. And that, in terms of state building, that comes before anything. You can't do anything without that. So I think that has a different set of incentives than vocational training.
So we have 3 minutes until we need to end, and Andrew Schrank had a hand up, and I saw Tony also wanted to jump back in. So what I'd like to do is invite Andrew to pose a question, but if there isn't, you can discuss it downstairs.
I'll take it as feedback.
Okay? Yeah.
Yeah, I guess I suddenly have a comment as well as a question. The comment is just, I think almost all of these countries, the escapees, were either authoritarian or under dominant party regimes in the key years. And I think that's worth considering in the context of intertemporal bargains where you're supposed to be tightening your belt now in order for some long-term path. That's not my question. My question is, what's the key unit of analysis? We've heard about individuals, these 2/3 of Latin Americans who think their schools are okay when their schools are terrible. We've heard about firms, Nokia, Telmex. We've heard about types of firms and multinationals versus SMEs versus domestically owned companies. We've heard about sectors, rubber gloves versus automobiles. We've heard about regions, Penang versus Greenville, and we've heard about countries. And so I'm wondering, when you think about the project, is this an analysis of which of these units?
And notice when I put in the research, it's like start out with firms and then it's segued, hopefully, somebody will pick that up as you did. You want to answer, should we answer another question?
If you can do it in 1 minute. My recommendation would be let's collectively thank our speakers and come on down, talk, chat with them some more informally downstairs in the pod down there.